Under miljontals år har djur utvecklat sofistikerade parningsritualer. Fåglar dansar, vargar ylar och Oscar går in på Amazon för att förbereda sin date night lasagne till King. På Amazon hittar han levande ljus, lyxiga vinglas till fyndpris och en extra tandborste utifall att. Date night får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med fyrhjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Get ready Sweden. BetMGM är här. Nu kan du uppleva spänningen från Las Vegas i mobilen. Ta chansen att spela på Bellagio roulettebord eller våra exklusiva MGM-slots. BetMGM. Casino och sport i mobilen. Åldersgräns 18 år. Regler och villkor gäller.
Today I'm speaking to Erik Hoel. He's an American neuroscientist, neurophilosopher and fiction writer. And I came across his writing on Substack a while back, and he wrote really interesting essays about AI and the threat AI poses to humanity and why people like me were right to be worried. So since he's an expert in the field and an expert in neuroscience, I wanted to bring him on the podcast and pick his brain, so to speak. But when I reached out, it turned out that he was just finishing up a non-fiction book with the title The World Behind the World. And I'm really happy that he now, since the publishing of the book, has time to be on this podcast. And we speak about artificial intelligence, but also about his book, which is really interesting, and it's about neuroscience and the failings of neuroscience and why it is that we still don't understand that much about what a consciousness is and how it works. And how is it that we succeed in so many fields of science, but we cannot figure out what kind of being we ourselves really are? And I highly recommend this book if you want to delve deeper into these questions and the science of it. But now on to today's guest. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Erik Hoel, to Rak Höger.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on, Ivar.
It's very nice to have you on. I stumbled across your writing on Substack and then onto your books because I got very concerned with artificial intelligence. And basically, I've been pretty uninterested in it for a while. I was very interested in it from like a science fiction reader sort of perspective, like watching Blade Runner and enjoying it, and then discussing it with my friends, and then like leaving it behind until the next movie came along or the next book we read together. But then Midjourney came, and I fooled a friend of mine who started taking up aquarelle painting, and I fooled him that I had painted something. I posted it on his Facebook wall, like a comment on his latest, and it had taken him months to do it, and it was beautiful. But I mean, he's not an accomplished artist, and I just posted. I started a little bit myself, and then I just posted something I prompted Midjourney to do, and everybody was super impressed. And then I said, no, it wasn't me, it was Midjourney, and everybody got quiet. And like I realized that I breached sort of a protocol. You're not supposed to take credit for something like this, and it's sort of not polite to do it to someone who's actually learned a craft, that you bring your robot friend along and he does it better, or it does it better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been a very strange shift all of a sudden for all of us to be catapulted into a world where human intelligence can be significantly automated, at least to a certain degree. I think that degree is quite high. If you look at the very latest models and you sort of know how to use them and prompt them. And as a writer myself, not just of nonfiction but also occasionally of fiction, I do think it's quite a world change. I mean, we may end up in a place where you can just demand a novel, from essentially Microsoft, and Microsoft just provides you with an entirely new novel that's coherent and about as good as a novel that you pick up at a bookstore. And it's very unclear what happens to writers and artists in that case. I think that we were long told that it was going to be that eventually everyone would have a robot and they would do all the menial chores and grocery deliveries, and we could spend all our time making art and painting and philosophizing. And then now we find ourselves in a world where very quickly the AIs are far better at, or at least far faster at, making art and perhaps eventually philosophizing. And we are still the ones, delivering the groceries and doing the menial tasks. So it seems to indicate quite an inversion of what people expected.
Yeah, and from Midjourney, I wrote one of the first articles about these Midjourney, DALL-E, and in Sweden, and then I started experimenting with it, and then very soon I felt disgusted. It was sort of akin to masturbating for the first time or something. Felt great, but then you feel like an onset of shame, and you don't know where it comes from, and then you start okay, why am I feeling ashamed? It felt nice. And then I found your writing, and that was, of course, more in about ChatGPT and the big language models, which are more problematic from my perspective, since I'm and I think objectively in many ways it is, because it's very hard to right now. Perhaps you can still see if it's a human or if it's a language model you're talking to, but in many cases you can't, and you get a suspicion sometimes when you chat to someone at a company, that this is not a human being. And I've insulted a few these like a paranoid person. But what is the and as you said, we were supposed to be the creative geniuses of this development, but it seems like our abilities is more cleaning the computers, doing the creative stuff. You just turned on the fan on your computer, and that seems like something a human is fit to do, and get in with our hands with the crooks and crannies of the computer.
Yes, and I think HVAC technicians who repair complicated pieces of machinery that vary household to household, those are going to be the very last people sort of replaced. I think even scientists who aren't doing experimental work, I think that we don't quite know what the upper bound is. Now, I'm still hoping for the best of all possible worlds, which is that AI progress stalls out rather soon, and you can prompt an AI to write a sort of mediocre stereotypical novel, but you can't just immediately prompt it to produce a work of true what would be considered true artistic beauty. And so and by the way, there's not a huge market anyways for any of this stuff. I mean, that's sort of very, very often ignored, but the simple truth is that if you're going to automate an industry, automating writers or artists is not an actually lucrative industry to automate, right? It's sort of been automated incidentally. I mean, just the market cap of all the publishers alone in the whole United States is probably dwarfed by the funding that OpenAI has, and how much the company itself is worth, OpenAI being one of the leaders in this. And so, my hope is sort of that the models don't get that much better than they currently are. And then also people realize that to some degree, it's that you're automating things that are not actually that lucrative. And so therefore, maybe it's not worth training $100 billion worth of compute to create the next biggest model series. But it's also possible that progress doesn't really stall out in any meaningful sense, and we sort of just continuously get smarter and smarter models, and they can do more and more things. And I think in that world, I have some radical opinions about it, but I think that once you sort of explain the situation to people, many of them agree. I'm basically in favor of what sometimes jokingly referred to as a Butlerian jihad, which is a term taken from a fictional book, Dune. So it's a term from the Dune universe, and in that universe there was this Butlerian jihad, which is essentially overthrew the AIs, and there's no AIs in Dune, and they're just outlawed. You're just not allowed to build these things. And I think I think if it really is the case that in 2 years we're going to have models that are smarter than the current models to the same degree that the models now are much smarter than the models that were 2 years ago, and that progress doesn't seem to slow, then I become rapidly in favor of it, especially because we don't know very much about how intelligence interfaces with consciousness, right? We are conscious beings, so we feel things. There's something it is like to be us. There's probably nothing it's like to be ChatGPT, probably. But that is a significant, moral thing that humanity as a whole has been entrusted with. We carry the light of consciousness. There's something it is like to be us. There are subjectivities walking around. And our intelligence is coupled with that. But these models might make it clear that intelligence doesn't have to be coupled with consciousness. The two could be completely orthogonal, right? You could, in other words, you could vary one without the other. You could have an incredibly intelligent, non-conscious being or entity. That certainly seems a lot like what ChatGPT currently is. And if it grew ever more intelligent, then that orthogonality would be ever more problematic. I mean, we really don't want to sort of be replaced by things that don't even experience anything or don't even feel anything, right? They're just hyper intelligent viruses. And if this all sounds like science fiction, well, we happen to be living in science fiction, right now, all of a sudden.
I think this, you could like argue for your radical jihad position a little bit, because I recorded a podcast and I've written about this issue a bit more than I did before, because I think it's one of the most important issues, but it's sort of hard to wrap one's head around it, and at the same time, and I'm not a computer scientist. I don't come from that background. I'm not a numbers guy. So it makes it even harder, perhaps. But I get a lot of pushback from people saying like, why it's always been like this. There's always people, Luddites like you, me, criticizing the technological development, and like, oh no, we can't have cars, and if we have cars, they cannot go faster than the horse and carriage, because that's the top speed that anything should have, and basically comparing me to backwards, people who don't want more technology, and maybe there's some merit to that, but like, what is your answer? Why should we fear the development of AI more than cars, for example?
Right. I think it's a good question. I think it's a reasonable question that people ask. I also think that it implies very much the wrong frame, which is that artificial intelligence is some sort of is some sort of just obvious next rung on the technological ladder that we're climbing. And so yes, people are upset about it or nervous about it, but it's, pick a technology. I saw somebody who actually works at OpenAI, I think, make this analogy where he said, well, people were, afraid of electricity at first either because they didn't understand it, and and the simple truth is that if you can't distinguish the qualitative difference between inventing electricity and inventing agents that are potentially smarter than ourselves, then you probably shouldn't be in a position of responsibility. If you really can't distinguish those two things, if you think that one is analogous, and that's because AI simply is not like other technologies. It's extremely different in form. And the reason why is because it allows for intelligence and it allows for agency. Now compare this with something like the technological changes to make humans, go faster, right? That would be like a car or something. But these are
I'm very sad that we don't have like cool exoskeletons yet. Like they have in the Starship Troopers books, where they could like jump several kilometers and stuff like that. That would be really cool.
Yeah, and I sometimes think, I mean, this is gonna, perhaps people will then think I'm even more of a Luddite than I am. But I often think, because I have heard this exact analogy of the cars before, and I always think, people used to sort of like ride their best friends, everywhere. Like you had this creature that you sort of loved and like was like loyal to you, and you sort of ride it everywhere. I don't know. It actually seems like a really cool way to live, and we sort of have replaced it with something that's a lot more efficient, in many ways. Is it really like the best of all possible universes? I have no idea, but to go back to the more serious.
No, but I think that's I mean, we have had a hard time adjusting. I mean, people who really some people name their cars because they start loving their car, but of course there is no response there, so you can feel sort of a resonance, but when compared to a horse, you can actually have a real relationship to a horse. And of course, you're just imagining that when with a car, the car doesn't care, but the horse actually it can care. So you have but this is a detour. But I join you in your jihad there. What
I mean is, even if some things are analogous, it's hard to say that we sort of always make the optimal choice, or is it sort of just that we make some choices and maybe they're a bit better, but there'd be some even superior alternative. But I honestly think that none of the cases are analogous. I mean, I think you have to go back to like radical transformations. Some people have compared AI to the beginning of to finding out how fire works, right? I mean, I think you really start have to making really radical analogies to get something that is equivalent. And so therefore, if we think about Luddism, we should consider we could consider what it would be like if it were not true. Like, imagine how absurd the universe would have to be such that every single possible technology that you can ever invent and popularize would always be good. Like, all tech trees are just great. They always lead to like wonderful outcomes for your civilization. And that sort of so obviously seems to be untrue. It's like far too much of an ask, but that's essentially what's subtly implied by making these sort of analogies. and clearly we choose all sorts of technologies to not pursue, and we're far better off for not pursuing them. This happens all the time. So this happens with biotechnologies. All sorts of biological warfare are outlawed. We don't want to pursue them. We don't want to make super viruses. And there are really strict international laws and agreements around doing so. In terms of energy production, there's a huge market incentive for better and better energy production, but we also have all sorts of regulations in place to prevent anything that's too destructive or too rampant, and that's to provide energy, which is really fundamental. So I think that it's completely reasonable to say that we should have significant regulation around the creation and the deployment of AIs, and that only you have to sort of be a wild optimist and have these strange assumptions that every single tech tree is going to lead to an amazing place if you think that creating autonomous intelligent agents which have been completely limited to humans since we probably murdered the last remaining relatives that we had. It's been tens of thousands of years where it's essentially just us, and now we have these new things around. Again, I just don't think that the situation is analogous at all. And the thing I'm most concerned about is consciousness. Is that I don't see. I think it's very likely these things are not conscious, and so therefore you're sort of paving the way to get very intelligent, goal-oriented, non-conscious agents. That seems, from any sort of moral perspective, horrific, right? Especially if there's any chance that you end up replacing one for the other, which I think that there is a real chance of, either fast or slow.
I think I often return to in my mind at least a YouTube clip from when one of the worst people on Earth, I would say, Jeff Bezos, he went out into space, and he brought along William Shatner. And William Shatner, of course, played one of the best characters of all time, James T. Kirk, in the original Star Trek series.
Agreed.
And William Shatner tried to talk to Jeff Bezos after landing, and he about this profound sadness and loneliness that he felt in space, and he wasn't really prepared to feel that, because of course he's not been to space in reality, but he's been to space several times in fiction while playing characters. So maybe he should have experienced been exalted and felt like, oh, wow, it's finally happening, and this is the last frontier, and I'm here. But he didn't, and Jeff Bezos didn't. He had no patience at all for William Shatner, for this old man sentimentality. I brought you along because you played James T. Kirk, not to have these long-winded philosophical speeches. So he just goes, okay, that's great, and pops the champagne with the beautiful women, woohoo, and William Shatner is just left there standing with all his loneliness, and I sort of feel like the vision that you lay out, if we have an AI without consciousness, that's like visiting space with William Shatner. And I feel like the other people who are very optimistic and very positive, they are people celebrating, we've created AI, woohoo! But there's no, that's one of the worst. It's even a worse nightmare, maybe, that you end up being replaced by something that's that's not conscious, but still takes over, and maybe humanity's long gone, everything is gone, and we created this, and there is no consciousness left. The consciousness is just snuffed out forever. But you just have this zombie intelligence that's super intelligent, but there's no one home, and that's even worse in my mind than if it's conscious.
Yeah, I think absolutely there's something insectoid about it, right? And I think the dangerous thing is that we used to think that consciousness and intelligence were very tightly coupled. if you, and certainly these AIs are based in, at their very origins, they're based in modeling how the brain works. So they're based in artificial neural nets. But the thing is that these artificial neural nets are structured, quite differently in many cases than our brains. And we know how our brains work in the sense of we know that they're constructed of neurons, but we don't really know any of the big questions about how the brain actually functions. And so this creates a really big problem, which is that these AIs, while they're based on sort of the micro detail mechanical workings of our brain, they're not based off of the big high level functional understanding of our brains. They're not, in other words, they're not replicating human cognition. They're sort of coming at it sideways. And that means that I think it's very possible and very likely that none of the things that really make humans special, whatever exactly it is that generates your stream of consciousness, whatever conditions your neural dynamics have to meet in order to have a consciousness, is just not present in these AIs, and yet you can sort of scale them up and make them bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually you have effectively this like non-conscious sort of vast intelligence. And I personally agree. I mean, I think it's a horror. I also think our inability to understand consciousness should make us wary in another direction, which is that because we don't have a good scientific understanding of consciousness, so we can't quite tell where it ends and where it begins, exactly what creatures have it, and so on. The other possibility is that we are doing something involving consciousness with these things, like say during the training phase. They're experiencing something, as they're learning, and maybe what is happening is sort of, horrific. I mean, we just have no actual way of knowing or debating about these subjects, simply because neuroscience is so far behind. And this is something that I talk about a bunch in my most recent book. Neuroscience is just so far behind and has not given us a theory of consciousness. So it's very sad, because it's like right when we would like to use one, we don't have one, and that's very much a direct failure of science. And it was one that we could sort of ignore because we weren't creating alternative intelligent entities. We could sort of just pretend that we had a good understanding of the brain and of consciousness. But now that these things are actually happening, I think that we can't really like pretend that or ignore the problem anymore. I think we have to sort of admit that this is a real serious problem. This is a scientific problem. This is something we actually need to figure out.
I'm glad you bring up your book. I just finished your book before this podcast, and it's called "The World Behind the World," and it's sort of surprising to some of us from who are come from softer subjects, and we are more used to being like you read stuff and then you realize how maybe this can't you can't predict anything about this. It's more of it's very soft and like political science. You can't really. It's very interesting, but when you try to nail it down, it's sometimes hard to know if it's really a science or if it's some sort of very advanced, sick form of entertainment for a select few. And maybe that's fine sometimes, but you always have the sense that there are other people in other departments who are doing serious stuff. And neuroscience is one of those sciences. For me, at least, it's been like, oh, you're mapping the brain. You can see that this part lights up, and that's located in the prefrontal cortex, and that develops then. And then if you cut these, but then if you read your book, you realize that there's not been that many breakthroughs. And like, could you just like outline? Because what you do very good and very it's make it very easy to understand. It's the difference between the extrinsic and the intrinsic perspectives, and like what is the difference, and why is that something that is in particular problematic for neuroscience?
Yeah, so the extrinsic and the intrinsic perspectives are essentially the two highly developed views that we have on how the world works. The extrinsic being the mechanisms of the world. So physics would be a great example of a highly refined extrinsic perspective, where everything is mechanism, everything is forces, everything can be mathematically described. And then there would be the intrinsic perspective, which would be our understanding of other minds and of our own minds. And this includes, also quite detailed, sort of quite detailed ways to understand minds. Like, for example, novels. Novels are essentially technology that allow us to represent and talk about minds. And, part of the book sort of traces the development of these two perspectives. But, the important part for us here is that they combine in neuroscience. And it's funny because even if you look at the history of science, Galileo is one of the people who essentially carves off the intrinsic perspective, talking about consciousness, talking about the inner workings of mind. He essentially carves it off from science very early on, and he says, "Do not look at this. So focus on the things you can measure. Focus on these things." And that was an immensely successful sort of way to pitch science. I mean, Galileo, we remember, he was a religious man, right? He's effectively just saying, listen, you can do science about the world. Don't look inside, like, don't look at souls. Don't think about minds. Don't do that. That's sort of, God's domain. And then you can pursue the rest. And that has been, I think, inarguably immensely successful. So, but neuroscience can't actually obey this dictum, because it is forced to sort of do both, right? It is forced to say, okay, we're dealing with this particular organ, the brain, but it has this strange special property which seems very different from what the liver has, which is that there's something it is like to be your brain, and there's not really anything it's like to be a liver, right? And that means that the job of neuroscience is really fundamentally to reconcile the two perspectives. And this was recognized very early on. Like, all the early psychologists were happy to use the term consciousness to talk about what the goal of psychology was to understand how it is that you have a stream of consciousness, the properties of your stream of consciousness. Early psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt would, who established the field, would do things like, have people describe every sensation that they can to try to create like effectively, like a chemical chart, a periodic table of experiences, right? And then this was sort of destroyed by the rise of behaviorism, and then and neuroscience was sort of forced to, neuroscience and cognitive science and these things that are supposed to try to figure out how people think. They were forced to develop for almost a century without being able to discuss consciousness, which is why they sort of had to have tied themselves in knots. You can talk about attention, but you couldn't really talk about consciousness. But think about how difficult that is, right? It's like what's the difference between something you're attending to and something you're not? Well, you're conscious of both, right? The attentional spotlight occurs within your consciousness, like within what you're conscious of, right? So but yet now we have to sort of remove one and not talk about it. So I think that's where the trouble in neuroscience comes into, and it's what's been so difficult for neuroscience to figure out. And the fact that neuroscience hasn't figured out it probably means that it's relatively pre-paradigmatic as a science. That means it's sort of more primitive than other scientific fields.
And like a more mature science, then you have what you describe as a theory that can lead you to plausible and interesting experiments, so that you know basically to use Donald Rumsfeld's terminology, there are more known unknowns than unknown unknowns if you have a more mature science. So the theory actually leads you in more fruitful directions. And neuroscience right now has been like, I mean, we've heard about these brain imaging studies, and something that was news to me, for example, was that many of the results is actually an averaging of large populations. So you have like, okay, if you show like a scary scene on a movie, and then you have like a brain imaging on 1,000 patients or 1,000 people, and then you take an average, and then you can see that basically these areas light up. And but those averages does not have an explanatory power for for the individuals. So what you're really doing is sort of a statistical it's a statistical fluke basically. And
and people have even directly investigated, are these averages, do they represent something that the brain themselves even care about? In that you could imagine it as, okay, so let's say you have this big average of people who are frightened, and no one's, we're sort of making up a study here for explanatory purposes, so people should keep that in mind. But effectively, it would be, imagine you're looking at all the parts that light up when 1,000 people see this scary movie. Now, and you say, well, that's, different parts are lighting up, compared to if they were seeing a different scene, like a love scene or something, or neutral scene with neutral valence. But then you would expect, okay, so the people who have a brain response that looks more like the average, they should be the ones who are like more scared, right? And then what you'll find is no, it really actually has nothing to do with it. Like, you can't take individual brain responses and sort of reason about them from this average. And if you can't do that, it becomes very unclear, like what on earth, what is the sort of information that you're getting? And a big issue is just that the contemporary techniques of neuroscience are not really up to par for understanding the complexity of the brain. And we know that because occasionally a neuroscientist will sort of break ranks and take the tools of neuroscience and apply it to a much simpler system. One of my favorite examples of this is a 2017 paper called "Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor?" And in it, the researchers take this very simple computer chip.
Nu kraschar den igen.
Nu kan du ringa Albin på Elgiganten Företag.
Nej, men jag behöver bara rensa ut lite filer.
Nej. Ring Albin.
Nej, det är lugnt. Men nej. Daniel, vad gör du?
Nu måste du ju ringa Albin.
På Elgiganten Företag ställer vi upp vad som än händer. Det gör oss till hjälpen du vill ha, inte bara behöver.
Trippelt välkommen tillbaka, säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
That can play Donkey Kong, and it's basically the minimum system.
Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, and there was one more game I think was used. Like that was the actual chip. It was used for those like 3 games, I think.
Yeah, that's right. It was like reconstructed by like retro computing enthusiasts, right? So you have this perfectly understood chip. And then the question was, okay, let's pretend we don't know that this thing can play Donkey Kong. Can we apply the tools of neuroscience to the chip to figure that out, right? So we can knock out parts of the chip, right? This is something that's done in neuroscience, lesion study. So we can lesion parts of the chip and see what does what. We could measure the information flows across the chip. So we could look at like the mutual information. We could average the chip together into voxels, sort of, like coarse grain it the way that like fMRI looks. We could look at the locations. And they do, basically, the main techniques of neuroscience. And their final conclusion is that there's absolutely no way that they would have any conception that this thing plays Donkey Kong. Like nothing told them about Donkey Kong from the information they had about the chip. And that should be
something you bring up in that study in your book was they actually like removed certain parts of the chip, and then it was impossible to run Donkey Kong. So, but not the other two games. So then they're like, okay, so that must mean that these 96 parts or neurons is essential for running Donkey Kong. But it turns out that wasn't the case at all. It was sort of the way it was Donkey Kong was coded in the back. It wasn't essential for running Donkey Kong, but it sort of like it was required to boot it or something like that. So it gave it even that turned out to not be an important finding.
Right. It wasn't like they were knocking out, the chip that controls how the barrels are placed in the game or something. Right. It was like Donkey Kong stopped working just because of nothing that had to do with Donkey Kong, the game itself. And even more broadly, there's a very well-known problem, which is that artificial neural networks, and this is a really big problem in AI, to bring it back to that as well, that they are black boxes. They're mathematically black boxes. And I have asked this of many neuroscientists. I myself, am a neuroscientist. I got a PhD in neuroscience. And what I have continuously asked is something along the lines of, if we can't even figure out how artificial neural networks work, and these are things that are much smaller than the brain, and we have perfect access to them. So we sort of have this ideal environment. And versus in the brain, if you work in neuroscience, you'll quickly understand nothing is ideal. Everything is through like an opaque wall of bone. Yes, you can do animal experiments, but everything is incredibly statistically noisy and difficult and so on. So you have this incredibly complex, a much more complex system that is much more opaque in terms of how you can access it experimentally, in terms of what you know about it. And then the question is, well, why should you expect to be able to learn almost anything about that system if we struggle so much for these much simpler systems that we have complete, access to? In other words, why shouldn't you think that that's like a really big problem? And I've never gotten a satisfactory answer to that. I think you either have to say essentially that somehow the brain is much simpler than these artificial neural networks that we're building, or that there's something unique about biology that sort of does make it simpler, so that these issues of it being a black box doesn't apply. But it's very unclear why that would be. It seems incredibly assumptive. So and to me, something I've just to say that it's not all sort of dark. I think that the issue is that there's no real big theory of brain function, and the reason there's no real big sort of overarching theory of brain function is because the main thing that the brain does every day is run your stream of consciousness, right? So you wake up in the morning, your experience starts, you're running your stream of consciousness. Almost everything about your behavior is explained by what's going on in your consciousness. You need coffee, etc. And so all sort of your brain's primary function is to keep the stream going and then to perform actions off of it, and that. But we're also not allowed to talk about consciousness. So then it's like, I have an organ, it has its main function. I can't really talk about the main function. I can talk about the main function maybe in parts, and so on. And so you get a situation that looks a lot like, biology before Darwin or something, where, there were biologists before Darwin, and you couldn't say, they're not doing biology, right? That would be too far. But without an overarching theory to orientate itself around, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That's a very famous saying. And I would go further and say, nothing within the brain actually makes sense except in the light of consciousness. And yet we don't have a good theory of consciousness. And the number of people actually working on one is incredibly low, probably a couple dozen people seriously working on the problem.
And you have a metaphor in your book that's since I read it, it stayed with me, and I've terrorized people with it because it's terrorizing me. And it's I think it goes like this: you imagine you have a map of an island, and the island and the map is so detailed that every detail of this island is on the map. And then you place the map on the island. So in theory, if all of this is true, then that map must now contain the map itself. And that map must contain itself. And this basically gives me the same feeling as when I try to think about when my kids ask me how big the universe is. You feel like this, you can't stop thinking about it, but you sort of drown in it. And if you have that level of complexity, basically then if I read you correctly, like a theory about the brain and about the consciousness that would make us be able to understand our consciousness must have that level of complexity that it makes it's as complex as reality itself, and that was unwieldy. And maybe that's sort of a limit of what we are trying to do here, that this map that we are trying to draw requires so much complexity that it boggles the mind. I'm not one of the best minds in the world, but I'm not stupid either, and I think this sort of a vertigo that I experience is it might be that a no-go zone, at least for my brain, to understand how this works. But like, is this a problem? Like, are we trying to understand something that we can't really understand?
I think it's a very reasonable question that should be asked far more. In the book, I talk about it and give it the term scientific incompleteness. And the idea would be that there are some, if science were complete, then that would mean that it can answer effectively every sort of reasonable question, every sort of reasonable scientific fact that we would want is available for discovery. And once you frame it like that, I think it becomes sort of obvious that maybe you should say no, right, or maybe you should slightly be biased towards saying no, because you're like, well, that would be incredible, right? Maybe that is the universe that we live in. But to draw an analogy, in mathematics is known to be fundamentally incomplete, in that there are sort of these paradoxes and holes that lie at its foundations, and they're things that no one has ever really gotten around. And in many cases, they don't affect working mathematicians, and they can ignore them. But in some cases, they do affect what the mathematician is working on, and you can't really ignore it, and you have to accept that the thing that you're using to generate knowledge, in this case mathematics, has some sort of paradoxes or incomplete parts to it. And so then when we just think about it via this analogy, it would be like, well, why would science be so much better than mathematics and logic? It would seem, the natural conclusion would be sort of the opposite, right? Where if you're starting with set theory, you can sort of fulfill some of Hilbert's original problems and set everything on a firm. foundation of knowledge. But starting with science is very messy. Science is sort of in the real world. It seems like quite an ask. Now, again, it could be quite possible. But if science were to be incomplete, the question that I asked was, where would you expect the problems to be? And I think it's very obvious from what we know about how incompleteness works within mathematics that a lot of the problems and paradoxes are initially formalized and triggered by self-reference. So when things begin to refer to themselves. So in this case, the example of the perfectly detailed map of an island suddenly floating down and being placed on the island itself triggers this infinite recursion. That's because of the self-reference, right? It's like the map is now referencing itself, and that's where this problem is coming from. So
it's like this scene in Being John Malkovich when he enters himself and every character is saying Malkovich. And it becomes nightmarish very, very rapidly.
And so if we were just to like broadly zoom out and look at science and say, where would we expect there to be problems? It would be when it comes to self-reference. And quite notably, it's been, a couple hundred years now, and we don't have a good scientific theory of consciousness. And in fact, there are all sorts of philosophers who make very complicated arguments, supposedly showing how, like, almost conceptually impossible a solution would be. That there's you briefly referenced the term zombie. There's something called like the zombie argument, which is probably the most popular argument and in philosophy of mind, and the most field defining one as well. And in it basically says, if you propose a theory of consciousness, I can always sort of imagine a world where that theory of consciousness is sort of being instantiated materially, but you're still lacking the subjective qualitative parts. So there's almost like proofs of this inconceivability of even a solution to the question. And that's what you'll find if you ask people who work in consciousness. They'll say, work to research consciousness. They'll say, we sort of have some ideas, but if they're honest, they'll say we don't even really know what a solution looks like. It's almost like unimaginable to us. And so therefore that would link up incredibly well with exactly sort of the a priori prediction that we started with, which is that if science were to be incomplete, you would find significant issues around self-reference. Now, I think you have to, you can't reason too far from something like that. In the end, you can have sort of look at suggestive evidence. There's also been some discovered undecidable properties in nature itself. I mean, this is something that physicists truly do talk about. An example would be the spectral gap, which is a particular physical quantity, and there's no sort of overarching way to calculate it. And it's known that that's because it's undecidable. You can trigger paradoxes with it. And everyone sort of just goes about their business, sort of ignoring that sort of thing, right? Like that was a Nature paper in 2015. So this is not, some kook saying this. This is like people that definitively agree, and there's a direct proof of it. Yeah. But it's sort of swept under the rug. And a great example of this is Stephen Hawking, who everyone knows as sort of the triumphant search for a theory of everything. That's one of the things he's most known for. But he's much less known for his later views when he began to think that maybe a theory of everything was impossible due to issues around paradoxes and self-reference. And specifically, he thought essentially that by basing physics on mathematics, you had the paradoxes of mathematics creep into physics, and that would prevent things like discovering a theory of everything. So, it's absolutely not crazy. I mean, some very intelligent people have thought that maybe scientific incompleteness might be the case, and I had never seen it sort of put together well wherein the obvious conclusion was drawn, which is that if it were to be the case, we should expect it around issues of self-reference or sort of ultimate questions, which often, subtly contain issues of self-reference. Perhaps that would be the case for a theory of everything. It might be the case for consciousness, and it might be the case for, questions that seem to look very paradoxical, like, why is there something rather than nothing, or something like that. Well, all those sort of questions are things that science has a very difficult time answering. So that was part of my goal in the book, was just to lay the argument out in a way I had never really seen it done. And there's no way really to prove scientific incompleteness without a bunch of assumptions, about science being some sort of formal system and so on. But I think that there's enough outside evidence for it to be worthwhile to consider.
And it might sound strange, because sometimes when you read about sort of all the failures of science in different areas, consciousness be one of them, then I can be overcome by a great sort of fatigue and have to lay down, because it's too big. But the incompleteness, I think, is the opposite. It gives me energy. And you end your book with sort of a scientific case for free will. And if I've argued, this is not any area of expertise of mine, but I've argued in articles that there is basically no free will, and that's because there is always a proximate cause for a behavior, and this is of course a very reductionist argument that A causes B, which in turn causes C, and then in the end what we feel is our free will is basically sort of something that was set in motion long before, and we are just our consciousness is basically the witness to actions that are it's been happening. But that sort of it might be philosophically true if you have a complete causality, and you could map the causality, and that would be possible. But if there's an incompleteness or a layer of chaos, and then that would actually not be true, and then that's actually something that I find sort of hopeful. And if it makes you tired to think that there's no free will, it's sort of like the immense amount of everything it's put on your shoulders, like something happened 3 billion years ago, and an atom pushed another atom around, bullet it, and that's why I now have to punch this guy in the face. That's sort of it's too much of a destiny for a small little human. But if you have the incompleteness, and you have the chaos, and you have sort of that, so it's sort of more of an existential humility, I would say, that you can't actually predict everything, because it's not that you don't have the information only, it's also that it might not be predictable in the first place. Am I representing the case, or
and I think but I think one way to view it is that oftentimes these arguments get made and they don't really update based off of some of the things we've learned in the past couple of decades, just scientifically. So let's look at this proximal cause argument, right? Where it says, well, your current brain state where you're punching the guy can be traced back to your brain state the second before, and the second before that, and the second before that. But then also you can then keep going back, and eventually you're at the Big Bang, right?
Or Citizen Kane, when he you realize everything came down to Rosebud, like it was.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so if you sort of reason from the Big Bang forward, you can see this all unfolding, and then that's fine. But the issue is that there's this further claim, right, which is that, well, that then because of this, because we could trace the chain of occurrences, we can say that the Big Bang, equally caused your current actions compared to, your brain state just a little bit before. that is what we would, their brain state just a little bit before would be sort of what we would want to be the true cause of your actions. But here we find that, well, we can also judge it off of the Big Bang. And so in this way, it would be an argument about causality essentially draining all the way back to the Big Bang, right? It's like, well, that's sort of the big cause, and then you can sort of repeat all the causes, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. But the thing is that, well, if you look at the mathematics of causation, and this was one of the big revolutions of the past 20, 30 years, is that we now have a pretty good mathematical understanding of causation and how causation works. And that's thanks to Judea Pearl, along with a few others. Judea Pearl won the Turing Award at MIT for this. So we do have a pretty good understanding of how, we can treat causes and do causal modeling and so on. And one thing that you'll find is that causation drains away. It's not perfectly preserved, and that's because systems can have things like noise in it. So in other words, if you can trace the events all the way back to the Big Bang, but if you started at the Big Bang and you sort of ran it forward, if there's things like irresolvable noise or uncertainty, and in many cases there appear like there are, then you end up with a very, very different world, from the exact contemporary world. So that means that there's only this very small sort of mathematical probability that your punch comes out of the Big Bang versus the very large mathematical probability that your punch comes out of your brain state just a couple of seconds before. And if we were to judge causation, we should judge it off of, the strengths of these conditional probabilities. And so you would say, well, actually, maybe you can assign some tiny marginal amount of causation to your punch from the Big Bang, but you should assign the vast majority of it to your previous system states. And that is something that, again, like most people have sort of, never heard of that. It's a very simple answer to sort of the proximal cause argument. And yet it's sort of sequestered, within these fields. So one of the things I wanted to do in my book was, bring up some of these various things that don't seem like they're, acknowledged within the free will debate, and that seem like, very viable alternatives, or things that are actually much, much harder to deal with philosophically if you want to give like an anti-free will position, because now we need to talk, what exactly do you mean by causation and so on. And I think that when you work out all the details, you end up with a very different answer.
Yeah, and like there's a like we live in an age where it's has been a lot of talk about big data, and of course, like the information gathering of these large language models, and how like if we just give it more data, and that will solve the problem. And what you also show is like it's very hard, even if you have a lot of data, like it's hard to calculate and get like the same result every time. And I think neuroscience is one of the a case in point, and the weather is like we have weather models that are better now than they used to be, but they are still like, there is no point in the future that we could like predict the weather in 1 year. We could have probabilities from where on Earth we are, and like it's probably going to rain more in Gothenburg than in in Madrid. But that's about it, and we can like have averages and stuff like that. But just a case in point, like our weather agency SMHI here in Sweden, they just issued a red warning to go into a part of Sweden where we were going with we're going by car, and so we decided to, okay, they say that this is the worst weather in 50 years and people should like stay inside, and it's awful. So we went to another place and just, okay, but of course it turned out that it wasn't that bad. We could have probably gone and visited the friend we were going to, and I could be angry at the weather agency, of course, but they are operating with the best models available. At least I think they are. But and that's basically the brain. Maybe that's comparable to the brain states and how to predict human behaviors.
I think that's almost it would be very strange if it were not true, right? If the brain were not anywhere near, as complex as the weather. Although there's this question of, is the brain sort of chaotic in this traditional sense? And, some people say yes, some people say no. But I think that, again, this is something that people don't realize, that even the word prediction has been changed to mean certain things based off of a better like mathematical knowledge. So first of all, there's chaos theory, which is that, if you have any small tiny perturbation, you won't be able to predict the future of it. And people know this from Jurassic Park. They know it from the weather. There's also and it does, they are sort of related in some ways, but there's also, another example would be like computational irreducibility. Computational irreducibility can kind of be thought of as the same thing, but framed in terms of computer programs. So there are some computer programs that you can't predict what they're going to do without running them. Now, every step is some logical function. Like there's no special ghostly force that's jumping, into the program. But it's just the case that you just can't predict. Like if you tried to predict what the program would do, what you would do is you would end up sort of working out the details of the program until you were effectively running it and then seeing what the result is. But now if I say, well, imagine that the brain like had that property, right? Which is that, well, you can't predict it without sort of letting the brain go out and do things in the world. And then if you say, well, fine, that's true, but I can still, predict your brain. Obviously, that's a notion of prediction that is bled of all, real meaning. Like it doesn't seem like a threat to my freedom at all. If you're like, okay, well, but your brain is, successive physical states, right? And it's like, well, can you predict what I'm going to do ahead of time? And they're like, well, I could, but I would have to create a perfect copy of you and then freeze you in time and then allow that perfect copy of you to sort of go about and do the things you're going to do. And then I could predict what you were going to do. And it's like, well, okay, fine. How are you going to predict what he's going to do? Right. And they're like, okay, well, okay, then I'm going to create a third perfect copy. Right. And so I think, the term prediction here is pretty bled dry, right? I don't feel very like deeply ontologically or metaphysically threatened, if my brain, has this property, and so I'm not to then say for sure that the brain does. Well, that's a different matter, but I think it's certainly possible, and again, people don't really know about it.
When it comes to AI, I've found myself getting sort of a little bit depressed about it because you feel like you could easily be replaced and by sort of an AI with what you do, and it could copy your voice and it could do anything, and then you start thinking about, okay, well, what is it like to be an actual human being? Is this something specific to being human? And you started asking these questions, and you might not do it like explicitly, but you started thinking like, is there an activity I can do? Is there something? Is there art that you can paint? Is there a job that only humans can do? And it's sort of and when you talk to certain people, at least, maybe it's my choice of friends, but some of them are like really like questioning their chosen careers, and it's not that they are being replaced as of now, or that they are like the value of what they're doing right now is diminished, but they see it perhaps a little bit further down the road, and they start questioning certain aspects of work and what it's like to be them and what it's like to be human. And I just wanted to ask you more of a personal question then, as writing in this field and PhD in neuroscience and everything we've been talking about. How is one to think about it, and do you think about it in this way?
I do. And in fact, I'm actually working on an essay about AI depression
Oh, really?
on my Substack. Yeah, off of I think it's becoming more common. There was an interview with Douglas Hofstadter, who's a very famous cognitive scientist. He wrote a best-selling book called Girl Escher Bach back in the 70s. And I think he's immensely depressed at the mere existence of these AIs. And I really hope I'm not butchering his name here. I'm absolutely sure that I am. Lee Sodal. I'm sure that that's a terrible pronunciation. Was the Go world champion, and Go was really what fell first. Go was the indication of the new AI age. People weren't really paying attention, but to beat somebody at Go, it's not like chess. You can't just crunch the numbers, right? It's a really elegant, expansive, high parameter game. And Go fell in 2016. They finally got computers to beat Go. And by the way, when I was all through academia getting my degree, everyone said AI was a dead field. And the example that they gave was that you'll know it's not a dead field when it can play Go, and it just can't play Go, right? And but when this world champion lost, he was the one who fought it like he like fought the machine. He quit Go because he said there's an entity that will never be defeated. And people still play chess, right?
I play every day, and it sucks to play computers. It's not fun, and you don't feel like victorious when you win either. It's just it's sort of just a fluke of the computer. I have a bad computer. You know that if it just computed a little bit longer, it would beat me.
Yeah, and I wonder like how humans would respond if everything became like chess or Go. We have some indications that people can still do things and enjoy things, but of course it's sort of like reverse. Like I don't write for me. Some people do. Some people say that they get a huge amount of joy out of writing. I get a workman-like joy out of the essays that I produce, or the articles that I produce, or the books that I produce. I get a workman-like joy of satisfaction and pride. But I'm doing it so that people will read them, right? So I'm doing it externally, and I think that that's where that the sort of the thread is, right? If the market for these things doesn't exist, then there really is no big significant reason for a human to get involved. And I do think that that's very depressing. I mean, I do wonder whether or not I am one of the last generations of writers to ever exist. That's very sad to me. I grew up in my mother's independent bookstore. I grew up selling books. I grew up reading books. It would be so sad to see that destroyed so that Microsoft's stock can go up. I'm just being really honest. I think that that's horrific. And that's not even the thing that most people who are concerned about AI are even talking about, right? They're talking about even far more horrific things. Like what if it kills all of us, right? Like what if we accidentally create something that's so intelligent that it can kill us? But even if stuff like that doesn't happen, I think there's a deep sadness to the whole project, and I think it's the first time in my life, and I think that experience is real, and it's something a lot of people are going through, where you're realizing that the past, just might not be recapturable, and that it's all going to change very, very quickly. And as I said, here's hoping it sort of doesn't. But I don't think it's unreasonable to be extremely worried. Extremely worried.
Thank you, Erik Hoel, for being part of Rak Höger.
Thank you, everyone.
Och stort tack till er som lyssnar. Gå gärna in och skriv en recension på Apple Podcasts eller i den app där du lyssnar på podden, så hjälper du andra att hitta den och du hjälper mig att bli bättre. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden, och du hittar alltihop på www.enrakhöger.se. Och om du blir betalande prenumerant idag så får du 20% rabatt. Då ska du gå in på www.enrakhöger.se/podd. Och betalande prenumeranter, då får man ta del av hela poddavsnitt, alla texter och exklusivt extra material. Och har ni några frågor eller synpunkter så tveka inte att höra av er på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka igen.